Welcome to the show. My name is Dr. Tullio Rossi. I'm the director and founder at Animate Your Science, and today I'm extremely excited because we have a very special guest. Our special guest today is Dr. Randy Olson, who was a tenured professor of marine biology at the University of New Hampshire. But then at some point, he decided to move to Hollywood and enter film school, which radically changed his life, which we're going to learn about more very soon. He has written and directed a number of films, including the acclaimed Flock of Dodos, and he's the author of numerous books on science communication and storytelling. He currently teaches storytelling as part of the ABT framework training program globally. Welcome to the show, Randy. It is a great honor to have you here. As you know, I've been a fan of your work for many years. You had a very profound influence over my career in science communication. So I'm very happy to have you here. How are you doing?
I'm doing wonderful. And let's add to that, you are the creator of that amazing little comic panel illustrating the ABT, which we've gotten a ton of mileage out of. Thank you so much for doing that.
That's great. I forgot about that one. I'm glad to hear that it is getting mileage. That's awesome.
That was what made us develop the big bond about, what was it, 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. It was great.
Fantastic. I'm very happy to hear that. So I know you recently came back from a very interesting trip in Nepal, where you taught the ABT framework to the heads of the World Bank. Tell us a bit about that. How did it go?
It was tremendous. It was two retreats they had there. The first one was with the leadership team of their sustainable development program. And the second one was with their South Asia water group. So about 25 people in each group. It was absolutely fascinating. And they took to it immediately. They desperately, desperately need the ABT. That's the first thing I can tell you. The World Bank, is in 180 countries, has 10,000 employees. And there were three different people on the first day who tried to, like at lunch and elsewhere, explain to me the structure of the World Bank. And for starters, they're broken into like 9 different sectors that are like sustainable development and risk assessment and climate and blah, blah. But then they're also broken into all these countries and regions that overlap. And then there's 2 or 3 other criteria they've got, and nobody could quite get it across clearly. And that's kind of their legacy, is that they're just a gigantic multinational well-intended effort project that does a lot of good in the world, but then also screws up some things. So communication is a major stumbling block for them. And there is a fascinating story that I've told in the course for 3 years about what happened at the World Bank. In 2015, a study was done about their use of the word "and" in their annual reports going back to 1946. And basically, they have been swallowed up by a plague of ands. The word and that's what happened. They did this kind of broad survey looking at the annual reports for patterns, and what came out was that the frequency of the word "and" has just increased year after year, starting at 2.5% of all the words in the reports back in 1946, and by 2012 it's over 5%. So it's more than doubled. And that's because they glue all these things together from all these different countries, and the document ends up being unreadable. That's a lot of what it was about. So that caught my interest because "and" is our first word of the "and but therefore" ABT template that we're going to be talking about here in great in detail. And is important because it's a word of agreement. That's how you begin effective communication. And so there they are at the World Bank, doing their best to communicate effectively, with each other through agreement. But it ain't that simple, because if you don't get some butts in there, then all you're doing is just spewing out lists and lists and lists, and everything gets along and everybody just all blurs together and it becomes unreadable. And that's exactly the circumstance.
So you get these giant reports that are just giant shopping lists that put you to
That's
sleep.
what it is.
Yeah,
That's exactly what it is. And as I gave that talk, all they did was nod their heads along. Yep, guilty as charged. We know this is our problem. What can we do about it? And it's not easy, but it's at some point you got to bring in the critical side, the contradiction, and that's the word "but." And in fact, our latest buzzword that has been developed among the people that's going to be in the new book is the "but bomb." And this didn't come from me. I've got 2 co-authors with the new book, Marlis Douglas and Keisha Barr, who are both professors of biology at University of Arkansas and Texas A&M, and they're the ones that brought it up. And they said our students came up with this term, the butt bomb, and they love it. And in the beginning, I thought that's a little kind of crude, and then week after week, it started sinking deeper and deeper. It's 80% of what the ABT is about is that it's about the butt bomb. Where's your butt bomb? That's what they said their students do now. Is somebody writes an essay or something, and where is your butt bomb? This thing is boring me. You need to drop a butt bomb on us. Does that make sense to you, the butt bomb?
It totally does, and I can see it being memorable and easy to remember. So I can see it working. Maybe it doesn't make sense yet to our listeners. So let's go step by step.
Step by step into the butt bomb, right? That's our
exactly. Okay, so let's go a bit back in your past. Like myself, you used to be a marine biologist. And you had tenure track, which is what most academics aspire to. At some point, however, you decided to have a pretty drastic career change, and you went to film school in Hollywood. So what made you take that decision?
If I had to boil it down to one word, that one word would probably be stifling. I found academia stifling, and it's interesting. It's a great place if you want to exist in a cocoon and just intellectualize the rest of your life. And it's important. And it's important to have people that do that. And creative freedom and all those things is really, really good. But academia and academic science in particular is by design stifling. And so the whole profession of science is very conservative and anti-innovation by design, as it has to be, because you can't build the edifice of science out of wacky, crazy ideas. You've kind of got to toe the line on that and foster a little bit of innovation, but it's well understood that the whole machine is run by these peer-reviewed granting agencies, and it just selects 4 very conservative research directions, which is fine for the vast majority of people. What always interested me was innovative things, novel things, going after things that people hadn't done before. When you look at the work I did as a graduate student with invertebrate larvae, I can point you to review papers that refer to the work as being novel and innovative. That was what drew me in. It wasn't as rigorous, I think, as people that did more conservative work, and I freely admit to that. But it was good enough to be published in lots of the best journals. I published about 20 papers. But a change began to happen as soon as I became a tenure track professor, it was time to grow up. As a graduate student and postdoc, you're given a fair amount of financial support to do work, to be creative. That's really the way the model is built. Those are your years to really do the wild, experimental, exploratory stuff. And then hopefully you lock in as a professor and you kind of calm things down and you begin getting the big grants that can support all the younger people like that. So I guess maybe it was a little Peter Pan thing. I didn't want to grow up. I hit that stage as a professor. I started looking at these committee meetings and going to the mailroom and seeing my mailbox packed full of memos and just looking down that hallway in the zoology building there, University of New Hampshire, and seeing a bunch of those old gray-haired guys doddering down the hallway and thinking, oh my God, is that how this career is going to end up for me? So I just didn't want that. And at the same time, I got increasingly interested in communication. I always really enjoyed giving talks, and my history with story goes a long ways back. There's something genetic in me, I think, that sent me in that direction. I'll give you one little anecdote, which was that when I was probably 6 or 7 years old, my mother, apparently, I don't remember this, but she told people about this years later, like at cocktail parties. She would talk about she had 5 kids, and I was the only one that she would be doing house cleaning during the day, and I would watch some TV show about cowboys and Indians or something like that. And then I would track her down the house and I would regurgitate like a tape recorder the whole story of what I saw in this episode. And she said it was the most baffling thing. She'd go from one room to the next, and I'd just tag along behind her. And then they did this, then this happened, but then this happened. And so that's long before I had any sort of consciousness. At that point, it's got to be something in DNA that causes a weird little kid like that to just sit there and be a tape recorder in front of a TV show. It's that desire to not only take the show in, but to feel the need to then relate it to somebody. So at a very early age, I guess I had that. And then when it got to science and I began giving talks at meetings, I really enjoyed that part of it. So the connection was kind of early on. And then there's one other thing, which was all the way from high school. I was driven to travel. I just really wanted to get out and see the world and try and get myself killed. You know, I really just did a lot of really crazy things in the travel. And I didn't get killed. And so I ended up with all these stories to tell. And that was really kind of one of my life's goals. And so as I got deeper into that, it naturally drew me into filmmaking eventually, which eventually I hit the fork in the road there at the University of New Hampshire. And there was, I made, you know, a couple short films out of my, paid for out of my own pocket. And I did this film that's still probably possibly my all-time favorite film, with three lobster fishermen on the coast of Maine, two brothers and their father. We had them tell stories for an evening. And I enjoyed that format so much that the next year I wanted to do a similar thing with three women scientists who worked in the deep sea submersible Alvin Woods Hole. Mm-hmm. And so I went to the Sea Grant people there on campus and pitched this idea to them and said, could you give me some money for this? And verbatim, this woman said, if we're going to support a film, we're going to give it to professional filmmakers. You're a scientist. You need to get back in your lab and do research. You know, why would we give you money? And you know, talk about anti-innovation. I said, because I think I've got a different perspective on this. I could do something really different and unique because I know these three women from having worked with them and gone to graduate school with them. And one of them was one of my thesis committee members. And so I ended up, paid for that thing was my mother. She hocked this $12,000 diamond ring, and we used that money to pay for that film. And that is the beginning of a long tradition of the science world not supporting much of anything that I've done for about 30 years. And that's the way it goes.
Wow, what a story. So at some point you find yourself in Hollywood, and you're back to school. And I know from your books that you had a bit of a clash with some of your teachers in film school. What happened exactly? How did your scientist brain get along with the artistic brain of Hollywood?
Well, there are two instances, I guess you could call clashes. The main one you're thinking of is how my first book, Don't Be Such a Scientist, starts with and that was actually an acting program that wasn't part of film school. It was a separate thing I did. It was a very intense, Meisner acting program in Santa Monica that ended up being the most important experience of my entire professional life. And this instructor was legendary. She was incredibly vicious, but that's the Meisner technique to begin with. It's legendary for being brutal and vicious like that. The first night of the course, she spotted me from the first moment. There were 26 people in the class, 25 of whom were young and beautiful, early 20s wannabe actors. And then this 38-year-old balding professor dude who stuck out like a sore thumb. So she got me up in front of the class to do the little exercise towards the end of the evening, and then just unloaded on me. And at the core of what she did, it took me 10 to 15 years to really process. But basically, what she was saying was, I've had your type in my classes before. You're an academic. You don't fucking listen. And that's, I got to drop the one F-bomb because it was all profanity that night as she screamed her lungs out at me. I've never been assaulted like that in public by anyone. I just stood there with my arms out wide, like, what? Why is this? And all the 25-year-old kids were screaming and howling as the professor guy got chewed up in front of them. But she went on and on and on with like that. And she said, I've had your type. I could break you. I could force you to learn this acting stuff. But it takes too much of my energy, and I don't have that energy anymore. Therefore, I want you out of this classroom out of this building in less than 5 minutes, or I'm having you arrested for trespassing by the police. And she meant it. Oh, yeah. No. And I walked backwards out of the studio that night, like, what the hell did I do to bring this on? And I went home and sat on the phone for 6 hours calling all my friends saying, oh, my God, I gave up my entire professorship to come out here and do this stuff. And basically the subtext of what she's screaming at me is, go away. You're not meant for Hollywood. What are you doing here? It was pretty shocking, but I hung in there, and she never was nice to me, but it all worked out. And she was absolutely right. Academics do not listen. When I published my first book, Don't Be Such a Scientist, the review in Science from Peter Kariba, the chief scientist at Nature Conservancy at the time, he said, nice book, but you skipped the most important problem of all, which is that scientists don't listen. And he said that verbatim in there. And as a result, when we did a second edition, I added a chapter titled Don't Be Such a Poor Listener, because he was absolutely right. Listening is very, very difficult. And that night, as she was screaming her head off at me, all I was standing there thinking was, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're an idiot, you're a moron, you're a fool, I know better than you. And I didn't. The only way that she got through to me, the only way that changed the course of events in my life, was not through kindness and sweet and sympathetic speaking to me. It was through assaulting me and cracking through that arrogance that you get as an academic. And that's, a lot of what my life journey is, the realization of what comes with academia. Not for all academics, some of them are wonderful, but there's an awful lot that are awfully arrogant.
Wow. What a story. Love it. Love it. It's well done for sticking, hanging in there though, and not running away.
Well, let me add on the punchline to that, which was that I was working with on this big movie with Patrick Swayze, and I was friends with the director there, and it was her husband who had put me in this acting class. And the next day I stepped into her office and said, your friend is psycho. And she said, oh my God, didn't we warn you well enough? And she said, hang in there, it'll all work out. So the next night I show up ready for warfare. I'd rehearsed this whole speech I was going to give in front of the 25 kids. I was going to say, you are practicing unlicensed psychotherapy and you should be arrested, blah, 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 blah. And before I could do anything, she came in and was pacing back and forth. Where's Randy Olson? Where's that? And I'm in the back, third row, and just kind of trembling. I raised my hand. And she says, why didn't you tell me you were best friends with one of the most important directors in this entire town? Imagine my horror yesterday when I went to lunch with her. And she said, what did you do to my friend Randy Olson? And then she turned to all the poor little kids and she said, I want all of you to know for the rest of this course, for the rest of the year, this guy is my love child. He is golden. He is sweet. I will never say a mean word to him. But the rest of you are all losers and you all suck and you're not allowed to say anything. And it was a cult type dynamic that went with it. But with time, you saw exactly what she was doing. And her basic rule was everybody shut up and listen because you don't know anything. And if you're using part of your brain to try and critique the way I'm teaching on this stuff, you're just wasting your time, because what little bit you can get out of me, you need every bit of your brain. And there's a tiny bit of an element that we do with that, with the ABT course that we run now, which is to beg people when we do our ABT build thing, don't sit there and critique the course and think about how would I do this, because we have 20 people that have put this thing together. We've put a lot of thought into it. And yeah, if you have one little suggestion, send us an email. But we've had 2 instances where people at the end of the course have written us 3-page detail. If I were teaching this course, this is how I do it. And it's garbage. It just shows you that they didn't listen to anything. Again, that's what you get with academics. They do not listen. I'm not sure when they ever will start to listen. I haven't seen any change in my career, but all you can do is keep pounding away at it.
Yeah, I can relate to that. So these days, you're known internationally as the creator of the ABT framework of storytelling. I know that there is a funny story behind it, which has to do with the animated series South Park. And I read that in your book, and I found it really amusing. Can you tell us that story and how the End by the Fall has to do something with South Park?
Yeah. Let's look at it at the biggest, broadest of all scales, at the core of everything we do, which is problem solution. And so that event of that crazy acting teacher was the formalization of the problem. And that was the moment where this person came at me so aggressively and basically said, you've got a problem. You're not as good with communication as you think you are. The beginning of the solution came with the night that I turned on Comedy Central in November 2011. And they had this half-hour little documentary about them called 6 Days to Air, the making of South Park. And what had happened was South Park started in 95, and by 2011, computer technology advanced so much that they were able to make every episode in just 1 week and 6 days in a week. And so they followed the making of one episode. And halfway through, they cut to this scene where Trey Parker, one of the 2 co-creators, is sitting in his office, and it's Wednesday night, and he looks at the camera and he says, and this is the point where we've got a first draft, 45 pages of the script. And then I take it and I sit down and I go through it using what we call our rule of replacing, in which what we do is every time we come across the word and, we ask ourselves, can you replace that and with a but or a therefore? Every time you can replace an and with a but or a therefore, the storytelling gets better. Well, I had been through 3 years of very intense writing classes at University of Southern California in the mid-90s. 5 courses at least. And I had never heard story structure boiled down to this simple of a form. But if there's one thing I knew as a scientist, it's the power of simplicity. And so I instantly sat up and then started calling friends of mine, screenwriters from my film school class, and asking if they'd heard of it. And they all said no, but it makes total sense. This is what's at the core of the monomyth structure and yada yada. I then set to work taking their rule of replacing and reformulating it as a one sentence template of and, but, therefore, and then began researching that and realizing it didn't start with them. It starts a long ways back, all the way back to the Greeks, and especially the philosophers in the 1700s who resolved the triad of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But most importantly, there was a legendary screenwriting instructor, Frank Daniel, that when I showed up at USC, he was the dean of the writing program there, and kind of his thinking ruled everything. Great guy. I took his course in script analysis the year before he passed away, and at his memorial service, the main speech was from David Lynch, the great director, who just said this guy was the greatest screenwriting instructor ever. And he was, Frank Daniel. He had a very analytical mind. And so Marty Kaplan from the Annenberg School at USC ended up finding this speech from 1986 that he sent to me from Frank Daniel. And in there are 2 paragraphs, which I've repeated in all throughout my books. In the first paragraph, Frank says, when we come up with the first draft, we always default to the dreaded and then structure. That's how you start off, pulling together a story. Is it just, you don't have the instincts to shape it yet. And then the second paragraph, he says, it's in the revisions and the editing that we begin to replace the and thens with the words but and therefore. And those give it the texture, those are turns in the story. And if you don't have those turns, then you just got this linear thing that just goes and then, and that doesn't work. So it's incredibly simple at some scale. It's infinitely complex. And then you look at a book like Into the Woods from a BBC producer named John Woods in 2014. And he's the only person I can see who has alluded to the idea that there's a fractal nature to story structure, that and you see that. You see there's ABT dynamics at all different scales. In his book, he talked about the tripartite nature of story. And what he meant by that was the ABT. He just hadn't heard of it. And so that's it, the 3 elements. And they are, the deeper dimension of it is the 3 powers. They are agreement, contradiction, and consequence. This is how we communicate. This is at the core of logic, of reason, of the scientific method, of comedy, everything. It's all these 3 forces of, we set things up with agreement, then we take a turn with contradiction, and then we advance forward with consequence. And once you start to learn those 3 forces, then you begin to spot them in everything that's out there. And then you begin to develop intuition ultimately. And that's the goal, where you can feel it. And that's when you finally can start to become a really good communicator. And until you have that down, I don't care. If you don't have the feel for those 3 forces, you're not a very good communicator. You can think you are, you can be handsome and gorgeous and be up there and people hanging on your words, but whether or not they retain anything of what you say, that's a whole different issue. That's all about narrative structure.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. I mean, learning the ABT, reading your books had such an effect, like on my career. Like, it just clicked when I read the books. I was like, wow, this makes so much sense. And it is really the simplest form you can boil it down to. And because it's simple, it clicks and it's usable. So you can use it in anything, from a tweet to a PhD thesis, a research paper, a grant proposal, just about anything. Well, the way I used it first was in scripts for my first ever video animation, where I wanted to explain my research on climate change in a way that didn't feel like a lecture, but in a way that felt like a story. It was the story of a baby fish getting lost at sea. Follow the end, but therefore I even matched the 3 stages with different songs that communicated 3 different moods. So the first part was the agreement, relaxed music. The second part was dramatic, the conflict. And the third part was looking at because of climate change, so open, events, looking at the future, end of century scenarios, so giving a message of hope. So again, a positive music at the end, and it worked so well. That video won 3 prizes in science communication.
There you go.
That's what it's not because the animation was amazing, because I'm not an animator, and the animation was very basic. was cute, but very basic. It was all about the story. That's really what made it a success.
It's infinitely powerful. From the first moment at USC Film School, there was a catchphrase people would say over and over again: "Story will out," and that was what they taught you at film school. Which is, at the end of the day, whoever does the best job with story dynamics, that's the person that will succeed over the long term. And you may have some setbacks, but that's the determining factor. It goes on endlessly. Now, have I told you anything about the MAT template?
The MAT template? I don't think so.
No.
Go
Let
ahead.
me lay this out because it's super important and matches exactly what you just ran through there. So at the start of the pandemic, we had to shift over to the Zoom world. And then who knew that it was going to blow up the way that it's been wonderful. The best thing ever happened to me. I was so tired of traveling. So we've put together this course that we're in the 30th rounds of it. We're running 4 concurrent sessions this fall, rounds, all the way up to 30. And the guy that was my assistant back then is screenwriter Matt David, and I had him start doing the logistics of the course. And I said to him, you don't have to listen to any of this stuff. This is all a bunch of scientists talking communication stuff. And by about the 4th or 5th iteration, he began saying things to me. I'm starting to hear things that I haven't heard in the screenwriting world. This is really powerful stuff. I mean, it was inevitable. He had to sit through every one of the sessions. And then he began to offer up these little suggestions bit by bit. And then he got better and better. And then I started having him run some of the side workshops. And then he started learning stuff there. Finally, at the beginning of this year, he said, I ran a workshop yesterday with some folks, and I wonder, how does this sound to you? I told them that, look, the ABT at the simplest of all levels is as simple as this. It's about heaven and heaven, but hell, therefore action. And I took that in, began soaking it through, and within a few weeks, like, oh my God, this guy and his empty head, forgive me for calling that, but he and I both laugh about that. He took it to a further level than I could. My mind is so analytical as a former scientist that I couldn't take it to that level, but that's what it is. And you start to think of, and that story you've told us there about your word-winning fish story is exactly that. It was heaven and heaven with that heavenly music. Everything was perfect. But then it was hell, and then eventually it was action to get out of there, and you had different pieces of music for that. Those little elements there become a test for people to do once you've made your ABT. Go back and look at it, and does it match that? Are you setting up heaven and heaven in the beginning? And so often, one of the fascinating things you find is that, especially with younger students, they don't have a context yet. They don't understand their field, and you ask them, tell me the narrative of your project, and they'll begin with the problem before they don't know how to set it up. They'll just say, we're sequencing these genes in our lab. Okay, but why? Give us a context, a world in which this stuff is important. That takes age, it takes experience. And what I remember as a scientist was the number of seminars where a young scientist would give a good talk with a bunch of stuff, and people would be asking questions, starting to pick it apart. And then suddenly some senior scientist from back in the back of the room would speak up and say, the reason this work is very important is because we've been working on this, and they would give the whole context as they knew how to do it. And the poor junior scientists just didn't have that knowledge and experience to put it in the big picture like that. But that's narrative. You need to begin with what the big picture is before we get to your problem. And that's the heaven and heaven. And there's so many deeper dimensions to this MAT template. I mean, we're kind of on fire about it. And one of the things that it shows you is your challenge in narrative structure is to build hope and stoke the fires of hope first thing before we get into any drama. Give us the picture of paradise, of what we want. Tell us about how good the world could be. And the tool we've developed for that is the if-then tool. Tell us about, if we can make these things happen, then look at this wonderful world we've got. Paint all that big picture, and then drop the butt bomb on us to ruin it temporarily. And as soon as that happens, we're upset, and we want the, what are you going to do? Therefore, what are you going to do? And now we're ready to listen to what you've got planned. It works so well. The mistake that is endlessly made by environmentalists who are so consumed and self-righteous and blabbing at the world about they know the way to fix everything is they start with all this bad news. We're ruining everything. And then they try and salvage things at the end. But there's hope. If we do this and that, that's backwards. There's no psychology to that. There's no persuasion. Give us the beautiful vision at the start. Take it away from us. You've motivated us deep inside. Now tell us what we need to do to try and get to that. And that's what we work on. And that last week with the World Bank folks, that resonates so much with them. It was really fun working on that structure.
It really is a universal problem, and there's an episode that is screaming in my head, which is a few years back, I was teaching science communication at the University of Xiamen in China, and this graduate student raises his hand and says, "Yeah, I see, but all I do every day is to write code for satellites. Nobody cares." And I'm like, hang on a second. But first of all, if that's how you explain to people what you do, I agree. I would not care too. But let me ask you a question. What are those satellites doing once they're up in the sky?
Yeah.
What's the bigger picture? What's the why? Why are those satellites up? Maybe they give us GPS and Google Maps. Well, something.
Well, and so now, in terms of what you're saying right there, add in there this if-then tool. Do you see how that works? You ask the person, okay, now use these two words, and if we can get these satellites to give us these data, then look at all the great things we can do in the world. That if-then tool, it cropped up a couple of years ago with a graduate student, Colorado State University in biomedical department. She did her thesis on opioid addiction. And she'd contacted me innocently saying, could you possibly help me with the writing of my dissertation? Just a tiny little thing. And next thing you know, I had her on the phone for 3 hours. And I said, we're not doing anything until you begin by giving me the 3 ABTs of your 3 chapters. And then we hung up, and she called a half hour later back and said, all right, here they are. And the third one, she said, this is about just figuring out these different neurons in the brain, which ones are involved with pleasure and which ones are involved with pain, and then a bunch of other things. And then I stopped her. I said, wait a second, who cares which neuron's involved with pleasure versus pain? And she said, well, if we can decide that this neuron's involved with pleasure, then we can design drugs that will avoid it, and that will avoid addiction. And then there you have it right there. And I said, why didn't you say that in your ABT? And she said, oh, everybody knows that. And I said, no, not everybody knows that. And even if they do, it won't hurt to use up a few words to say it explicitly, because that's so powerful. That's your hope vision, which is, if we can figure these things out, then we can come up with a world in which there's no more opioid addiction. That was the moment that this if-then thing hit me, which is, standard part of computer language and logic and all that sort of stuff over the ages. But what the ABT framework gives you is the exact place logically you want to embed that if-then, which is right before the but. So this is what's at stake. It's right there where you get us all charged out. If we can do this, then the world's going to be wonderful. Then you drop the bomb. And then there's a second version of the if-then you can use, which is, once you drop the but bomb, but none of that is happening, then you can use the if-then in the fear direction, which is, and if we don't start doing this in the next year, then the whole program is going to fall to pieces, whatever. So it's this tool that can be used in both directions, hope and fear. And then you come back to the world of Hollywood and screenwriting. That's the fundamental driving elements when they write screenplays. We hope the character will do this. We fear that he'll fall into this. These things are all very broad and universal, and increasingly more and more fun as the pieces come together, and we really can start to create things as never before. And my dog shows up here to be scratched on the head. Sorry.
That's all right. Good. So, Andy, you've been banging on these ideas for quite a few years now. Yes. Do you think the academic community is realizing the importance, and are they taking this on board, or there's some resistance?
1 second, we must resist the powers of protest happening here. Sorry about this. Eva, hey, let's go out here in the hall.
That's all right. We might edit this bit out or leave it because it's cute.
Come on, Eva, come on, out there. Yes, and let's hope she doesn't bark when I shut the door. Sorry, dude.
By the way, I will add that
yeah, it's 4 o'clock dog park time that she's sensing. So sorry. Okay.
I will add that the ABT and your books are now compulsory reading at my company. So when we get a new science communication officer, first of all, I try to sense the narrative intuition at the interview stage. If I feel that they haven't the full grasp, or it's a bit blurry, I'm like, read this book. First thing.
Yeah. Well, and on that note, we've got the new version of the narrative gym coming out on October 24th. And It's really the most up to date, and it's got those extras. So what we've now resolved is the 2 levels of the ABT. So there's the primary level, which is just the 3 words and but therefore, and everybody can pick that up right away. But what the course is about is a secondary level. There's at least 7 of those elements, like the if then I was just telling you about, and several other things of that sort. That there are the deeper dimensions of the ABT that we've learned through the course over the past 2.5 years, and that's what we now work on in detail. And that's taking you to the more advanced level where you can really start to get a lot of power out of it.
Beautiful. So the narrative, Jim, where can people find this book?
Amazon, the first 2 books, the 2 major books I did with academic publishers, and it takes so long. It takes 2 years, to pitch a book and have them pick it up, and then their committees go, blah, 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 blah. And it was good for those 2 books, but this is now trying to really implement this stuff. And as a result, we have published 4 versions so far of the narrative, Jim. I did the first one here that came out of the course after about a year. And then our business guy in the course, Park Howell, said, nice book, but my business people are not going to buy it unless you put business on the cover. So he and I went to work and did the business version, where we rewrote the first and last chapters to set the whole ABT into the world of business. Then our law guy, Doug Passon, said, well, you can't do that without doing it for law. So we did it for law with Doug. And then our politics guy, Dave Gold, same thing. We did one for politics. And so those guys are out there doing tons of work in those 3 professions. But it really underscores the idea that there's no such thing as science communication. I'm sorry. I know that puts a lot of people off that are so in love with science communication, but there is the communication of all these different disciplines, economics, sports, politics, all this stuff, and science is in there. They all draw on the same broad general principles. And the idea of having this term science communication sends a signal that, oh, it's different. It's not different at all. And the more you learn the broad universal principles, the better your chance of communicating well. And if you somehow think that, oh, this is, something special just to science, you're just misguided.
Yeah, I agree. A lot of what I know about communication, I learned from public speakers, because I joined an association called Toastmasters.
Of course, yes.
Which has been so useful. Like, I used to suck as a speaker, big time.
But
I decided to do something about it. Because nice. I didn't want to feel this sense of imminent death at every conference. Therefore, I joined Toastmaster. And yeah, in a matter of 1 year.
Yeah. Let me add one thing to that. And this is a little plug for the upcoming book, because my 2 co-authors, both biology professors who've been teaching ABT for about 2 or 3 years with their graduate students and their programs. And Keisha Barr has a story at the end of the whole book that she tells about one of her students who suffered from imposter syndrome. And, you hear a lot about that. And she just felt all this guilt when she would give presentations. Like, she felt like it was her job to be able to point people in the direction and say what's important and not important, what it was that she did. And if she couldn't do that, then she really was an imposter. Keisha introduced the ABT, got her trained up in it. And what the ABT gives you is the ability to weed through all that information, structure it, and figure out what to keep in, what to leave out, and to confidently say, this is the core thing I'm working on. And once you lock in on what that central ABT is, once you know what it is you're there to say, that, whether you like it or not, translates into confidence. And that's, I think, probably the biggest variable at all in confidence, is whether you really know what you're saying. Because if you know what you're saying, you can do a bad job of it, and then you can get into a spat and end up arguing with people. Look, at the core, what I'm saying is this. And if you know it, it becomes confidence. And if you don't know it, you haven't thought through what your problem is, and you don't have a structure, then of course you're going to be terrified. And we had a similar thing. Patty Limerick is a history professor, and last year she began using it with history dissertation students or PhD students. And she told me the same thing happened there. These students that are working on these enormous topics in history with so much information, and they give talks and they can't even get it straight themselves. She began working with them using the ABT, and she didn't expect this, but all of a sudden she began to notice they were coming into her office and they were talking to her much more confidently. I know this is my central narrative. That confidence thing is crucial in communication, like it or not. We just had a president here in the United States who got away with a ton of stuff because he was so good with the confidence thing.
Mm.
And that's human nature. And I don't care how smart you are or how dishonest you are, or whatever, confidence is confidence. And, that's the bad thing, is that you get people with bullshit, but they got a lot of confidence, and it's hard for people to tell the difference. Whereas when people don't have confidence, you begin to doubt the very material that they've got, and I don't care how smart they are. If they're up there nervously correcting themselves and wandering all over the place, after a while, you begin to say, I don't think they really know what they're talking about. And that's bad.
Yeah, absolutely. We as humans, and as scientists, we like to believe that we're these perfect, rational beings, that we just need the facts, but we're not. We're just human beings, victims of so many biases, and one of them is to create a first impression based on what you see, the body language, the voice tone, and how the person, is talking and what is saying. Yeah, they might be the smartest person alive, but if they appear differently, that's what you think about them. Absolutely.
Well, and what you're hitting on is, in the long term, the only hope for sanity in our society, which is the realization that we've created too much information. We can't process it. And with that comes a shift from substance to style. This is well understood by information theorists and talked about for decades. And yet the science world hasn't begun to even look at the world through that lens. I can't believe the number of things I hear in the science world that are that you read or you hear that look like they're produced in the 1980s, and there are people doing it today. I was on a panel about 3 months ago on some ocean stuff, and the documents that they sent out, I wrote back and I said, were these written in the 1980s? Because they look like the same structure of documents, and we're in a different world now. We're in the TLDR world. Too long, didn't read. Can you concede that much at least? And my dog agrees. Jesus, I'm sorry. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's dog park time. So,
all right. So let's give one last nugget of gold to our audience. So if there's what's the number one thing researchers get wrong in your view in regards to communication, and how can they fix it?
It's that thing about listening. That's the be all and end all. And that's why Brian Palermo is my longtime co-instructor, is an improv instructor. And he teaches his own work now, but that's at the core of what he does in our course, is teaches listening. And the first part of the ABT, the agreement part, you can't do the agreement unless you listen. Hang on 1 second.
The dog is protesting today.
Sorry.
That's kind of cute.
She sees rabbits.
That's okay. Tell the dog we're almost done.
Okay.
I'm not keeping you for much longer.
Yeah. Getting back to that fundamental point, which is that the three forces are agreement, contradiction, and consequence. And you can't agree unless you listen. And so that's where it all begins. And if you're not listening, if you're just starting off lecturing people from the beginning, there's no agreement and there's no communication, and then it doesn't work when you finally get to your big problem, those sorts of things. So that is the be all and end all. And that's been our journey with the ABT, by the way. 2.5 years ago, when we were starting this stuff, we were saying that it's, the and stuff at the beginning, you want to minimize, you want to get to the problem and then tell us your solution. Mm-hmm. Well, with time, we've come to realize that the big challenge is putting it into the right context. And that's the and stuff. And that's where all the art exists. That's where all the humanities. The problem and solution stuff is fairly inorganic. We know the problem, we know how to fix it. It's that setup and the context and the framing and all those things. It's crucial.
Raising the stakes. So how can scientists become better listeners?
Improv and acting. I mean, that's what happened to me. That's the beginning of that first book, Don't Be Such a Scientist. It all began when I took this acting class with this confrontational instructor who overrode my arrogance, where I thought I knew everything, and she said, you don't. I don't care how well developed you are on the cerebral end, you've got nothing at the visceral side, and that's where the listening comes from. And that was the core principle, was that you got to come down out of your head with your heart, with emotion, you got with humor, and your sex organs with sex appeal at times. And that's the first chapter of the Don't Be Such a Scientist book. It's that shifting things downward.
And after reading your book, I actually signed up to improv classes here in Australia, and I will add that they're a lot of fun.
Yeah.
It's literally unleashing your inner child and allowing yourself to be creative and silly and just forget about who you are in real life. It's a lot of fun, and I think many researchers will find it refreshing and a useful experience. And yes, it will make you a better communicator, a better listener. Absolutely. So I do recommend that. Absolutely.
Is my dog ruining this audio? Can
No,
you
no,
hear her?
I can't hear your dog from here.
Okay.
All good.
Okay, good.
All good.
That's good.
Okay, so let's wrap things up. So we mentioned your new books, The Narrative Gym. We'll put a link in the video description. Last but not least, I know you offer some really good training programs for researchers. So where can people find out more about
I'm
them?
afraid the training program right now goes with institutions. And so the website is abtframework.com, and get a hold of us through there, but you kind of need to have an institution that can book the course. We don't do it individually training. But the substitute for that is the newest book coming out on October 24th, and there's already an advanced link for that on Amazon. And that book is The Narrative Gym for Science Graduate Students and Postdocs. And in particular, we've honed in on those two target areas because in a lot of ways, they're the people that need the communication stuff the most. Their heads are on the chopping block trying to get a job as a late stage graduate student, as a postdoc, and communication is everything at that point. So this book, I think, will be a really good manual for them. And yeah, that's what I would recommend.
And I'll last note, Randy's books are fun to read. I think he writes them by recording himself because it sounds like you're talking to him and he's talking to you. You know, they're very colloquial in the way they've written, which made them lighter and enjoyable to read, in my opinion. Is that how you write your books? Do you record yourself?
Nah, I just sit there and but I don't have any writing schedule. I just write when I feel inspired and just clack it away. I have fun, doing it. It's the whole thing is so much fun, and it's all come together now in this course that we run with 20 people. It's just really great, and it's working.
Yeah, and by the way, every researcher is part of an institution. So if you talk to your dean of graduate studies and make them aware of this training program, maybe it will come to your institution.
Absolutely. Right now, we're running 4 concurrent courses with Genentech, NOAA, and FAA are splitting one, Georgia Medical Schools, and then the World Bank. So those are the sorts of groups now they're getting it. And that's really rewarding because the foundations have never understood one thing I had to say. And the academic science world kind of doesn't get it either. But out there in these practical groups that are actually forced to communicate on a daily basis, they're the ones that are really thankful for this, and it's working great.
Fantastic. Well, Randy, I'm done with the interview and the questions. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for the listeners who joined us for the first issue of SWIPE SciComm, our new science communication magazine for researchers. Thank you, Randy. Have a great day in sunny California.
Great talking with you, Tulio, and I hope you can clean up my dog's attempt to join the show.
We'll see in editing phase.
Yeah, okay.